If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Crankbaits are my absolute favorite lure to use. But which one is actually my favorite? Now, I've tried a bunch of different brands, and honestly, there's no way that I could try every single brand, but I've tried several of the most common brands to test out so that you can know which one to buy for your specific situation. My top two favorite that I tested out right now was the Berkely Squarebull and the Booyah XCS. My name is Wesley Littlefield with Anglers.com, and today is all about the best crankbait. So if you find this content useful and helpful, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. It helps us out a lot. And we're always pushing out more bass fishing content, so if you like bass fishing, this is the channel for you. I grew up fishing a crankbait, specifically a Squarebill or a jointed crankbait, and that's pretty much what I had on if I was fishing. Whether I was fishing in a pond or fishing at the bank, I always wanted to have a crankbait tied on because they're pretty easy to use, but I also went through a lot of crankbaits because they're pretty easy to get hung up. So today I tested some of my favorites to see which one I really would want to buy again. And I started with, like I said, the Berkely Squarebull, and I absolutely think that it's a solid crankbait. There's not a lot of differences between crankbaits, so I think it ultimately comes down to personal preference for a majority of these. So let me down in the comments below what your favorite brand and your favorite crankbait is. Also, you can find all the links in the description down below too, so you can purchase whichever one that I'm talking about and is your favorite. Other than that, let's actually get to the reviews. So the Berkely Squarebull, it's at a solid price. It's a little bit expensive for crankbaits, but I mean, if you're anywhere from $5 to $10, that's typically average for a crankbait. So it's right there in between that, you know, about $10 range. A little on the high side, but not really. The pros, it's got a nice action. The water at my lake was surprisingly clear today. I could see it really well swimming through the water, and I did end up getting hung up with it, partly because I tried to drag it through a brush pile. It didn't come through the brush pile quite right, but I was fishing from the bank and I was able to get it undone. So that's a bonus too, that even though I did get hung up, I was able to get it back. As you can see, it's really rocky around me, which is the perfect place for a Squarebill crankbait. It's not a very deep diving crankbait, so if you're looking for a deep diving crankbait, this one's not for you. Obviously, I mean, Squarebill crankbaits are typically 5-foot tops. You know, you might get a little bit deeper diving one, but typically about 5 foot is where they max out at. It comes in a variety of colors, so whatever your favorite color crankbait is, I'm sure they're gonna have it. If I was buying it as a beginner, I think you would need like a crawdad color, so that's like a red and orange color, and then whatever your most common bait fish is, whether that's shad or bluegill or perch. So the Booyah XCS. This one I was a little leery about, I have to be honest, because it was on the lower end of the price range. And when I got it, the colors, they don't pop as much, which can be good and bad. This one was a little bit duller. It was just something different, and I kind of like that about it, but it was also a little bit less expensive. And I really like that about it, because like I said, I lose a lot of crankbaits because they just got treble hooks and they get hung up. And fishing from the bank, it's hard to go get them. Now my kayak, I'm a little better at it, but I've still lost crankbaits in my kayak. So it being a little bit less expensive makes me feel a little bit better throwing it into those places where I know there's fish, but I'm also scared that it's gonna get hung up. The biggest cons that I found were there's a limited number of colors or a limited amount of colors. They cover pretty much your basics, which I listed, you know, that you should have. So it's really not that big of a con. Then of course it kind of gets hung up, but at the same time, I was able to fish it all around the same places that I fished the Squarebill, and I didn't get hung up as much as with that. Now, this is a Squarebill crankbait, so it's not good for fishing it in the winter time. I had the crawdad color, so I'm a little bit early. I'm filming like in early February, and that crawdad color really starts to come through maybe more March, April area. So I'm a little bit early for that, but hey, it happens. The next crankbait, if you can call it a crankbait, it's a really funny looking one, is the XPS grass tracker. And I was leery about this because it looks weird. It looks like a crankbait that I left in my dad's tackle box in the sun, and the bill melted into a funny shape. I was honestly pleasantly surprised. It dives down to, you know, 3 to 5 feet-ish, maybe a little shallower. Sadly, I didn't have any grass to take it through. I've heard it goes through grass really well, but I wasn't able to test that today. I didn't get hung up around the rock. It was really easy to cast because it's a little bigger lure, so I didn't have any problems launching it way out there. It floats, you know, once it hits its depth, it stays about that depth. I really couldn't get it to go down very deep. Strike King is another very popular brand, and this one is a well-known crankbait, the KVD Squarebill. And I've got to say, I was really impressed with this one because I chose to get the little bit bigger profile Squarebill, and there's pros and cons to that. You know, I would like to target bigger fish, so I think a bigger profile lure will do that a little bit better, even in the shallows. But at the same time, you're not gonna get as many bites doing that. This crankbait was $7, $8, somewhere around there. So it's not crazy expensive as far as crankbaits go. And it had really good action, plenty of color selection to choose from. And really the only drawback is that it's a shallow water crankbait. So, I mean, can you really blame that? It was designed to be a shallow water crankbait. That's what it does. I got it, you know, down to 3 to 5 feet. Is when I started filling the bottom, and then, you know, of course coming up the bottom I could fill it all the way up. I kind of got hung up on in between some rocks with it, but I was able to walk around and pop it right out. So once again, yes, it's gonna get hung up because it's crankbait, but it's not that difficult to get unhung either. The last crankbait that I tested was the 6 Cents Quake. Now this one was surprisingly the most expensive because it's a lipless crankbait. I don't fish a lot of lipless crankbaits. I kind of use them as specialty lures in the matter, like, meaning that early spring and late fall is primarily when I fish them, a little bit through the winter. And I'll even troll with them in the summertime for like sand bass and stuff. But typically it's, you know, it's not one that is like my go-to lure. And so spending $10 on it just seems a little excessive. The cons were it's expensive, and you know, I didn't have a huge color selection to choose from. Now maybe a different store did, but when I was searching on Bass Pro, I didn't have that big of a color selection. Maybe they're just out of stock of it too, because I was searching at a pretty popular time for lipless crankbaits. So you might have to check on color selection a couple times. For $10, I wanted something a little bit better. The one thing that did stand out to me, and I have to clarify because it did stand out, I was like, oh, I do like this, was I think it would be a really good murky water or muddy water lure, because it had rattles, and I could hear the rattles in the water when I was 10, 15 feet away from it. I could hear them out of the water when it was still in the water. So if it's, you know, if you're looking for a lure that's gonna make a lot of commotion, be really loud, that one is hands down one of the loudest lures that I've heard. Now, as I mentioned, there are so many other crankbait brands out there. So if you have any lure recommendations, feel free to drop them down in the comments. But I guarantee you that if you go with any of these, you're gonna catch fish if you're using it at the right time of the year. Like I said, Squarebills aren't meant for early spring, late winter. They're really meant for that late spring, midsummer kind of time. That's when I catch a lot of fish with them, and on into the fall. But I've caught fish with all of these brands before. I have confidence in, you know, it doesn't really matter the brand to me specifically as much, unless I'm just really going for specific color. And I think that's when it tends to matter a little bit more. But now that you know which one to buy, or which one you think you want to buy, it's time to learn how to tie it to your line and how to actually rig it or tune a crankbait. Yes, sometimes you have to tune it. Sometimes it runs a little wanky and you've got to tune it. I've got a video down below me that'll explain how to rig it properly. And until then, I want you to always remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.